Hello, my name is Mickey Ebert, and today's presentation is on the role of resource dependence theory and institutional theory in public education. So, what is resource dependence theory? Good question. It is the study of how the external resources of organizations affect the behavior of the organization. Now, you might ask, what does that mean? Well, that's a good question as well. Organizations or school systems must engage in transactions with other actors and organizations in its environment in order to acquire resources. We'll get into that, what that means exactly, coming up next. So, how does resource dependence theory relate to our schools? School systems are in a constant battle for resources. We know this because they always need money. They compete with other schools and charter schools for this funding. These resources are typically money and political influence. The role of political influence is key, as we've seen in our district, as local politicians have spearheaded efforts to build new schools in our own county. Federal dollars are needed to pay for programs and grants as well, and state and local dollars are needed to fund schools as well as build new ones. And last, all of these items require schools to comply by certain rules, and it makes them dependent on influence from politicians as well as sometimes taxpayers and funding from these institutions, which oftentimes are the politicians or the local taxpayers or sometimes even county government. So how do schools use resource dependence theory? Well, first they need to acknowledge that they are dependent on the resources of the government and politicians. If this is established, it is easy to move towards the goals that they've set out. Second, work to establish relationships with local politicians who have influence to demand more funding for our schools and our school district. Third, work tirelessly to have a successful school system that has high levels of student success. That is the key in all of this, is if you work towards the student success, all right, everything else should fall into place. And fourth, high levels of student success will create stability in the school system and thus allow for the possibility to have more influence to bring in more resources. Back up what you do, basically. On to the second theory we will discuss, institutional theory. So what is it? The definition is, it is a theory based on the deeper and more resilient aspects of social structure. It considers the processes by which structures, including schemes, rules, norms, and routines, become established as authoritative guidelines for social behavior. So, what does that mean? Well, that is a good question. Essentially, it means that many factors can influence an institution, and in our case, a school, and pressure them to comply, shift, or change according to the pressures from their industry peers. It's a change with the times concept, if you will, and we see that in education all the time. So, on to the next question. How does institutional theory relate to public schools? Well, oftentimes schools react to ideas and the passage of new standards or laws that can greatly influence their chances of success in the grades of their schools. This reaction is sometimes abrupt and can be seen as negative, so it's best not to be caught off guard and to try to be proactive. That goes into the next point. Schools have seen an upswing of new ideas and agendas for staying up to date with the current trends of not just educational trends, but also societal influences. Our society influences us in more than just what we do in society, but it does influence education. We need to recognize that. Examples of modern major shifts in education that we've seen would be the implementation of online education as a graduation requirement. In the state of Florida, that is a requirement. In order to graduate from high school, you have to take one online education course. The increased push for the establishment of charter schools, very hot topic in politics right now, as a lot of dollars in the state have been diverted to charter schools. And a new bill requiring all students to take a financial literacy course. No one's really against this, but I can tell you the politicians who made this have never, or who have implemented this, have never made a high school schedule and kind of don't realize how complicated it gets to require one more course for graduation. Anyways, all of these are brought on by a changing view of education and outside societal influences. Educators didn't want these changes necessarily. They were forced to adapt with the times, and this is not a bad thing. I've never seen a change as a bad thing in education. Sometimes it's confusing, but it's not a bad thing. So, how would institutional theory relate to our schools? First, would be to accept that change is inevitable in education. I've never seen a school that has been allowed to stay stationary. They are always in a constant state of flux. Second point, instead of always being reactive to what is coming down the road, become proactive. We have done this in our district and have implemented objectives accordingly, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Third, shifts and trends in education come from other schools that have had high levels of success. As I've stated, we've done this, and at times we've been the trendsetter, so it's best to try to continue that. Next, invest time and resources in learning strategies that have made other schools successful and get ahead of the change. As I've stated, we've done this and should continue. Some of the examples go with the fifth point stating, we have done this with the implementation of our own online schooling option. Instead of requiring students to take courses through other online providers, we've actually created our own. So this is, we're ahead of the trend there. Also, as well as our use of enrolling students in AP and dual enrollment courses to garner more points towards our school's grade. So we found out that if we had a more robust AP program, as well as had students enroll in dual enrollment, we garnered more points towards our school grade. That was a very proactive thing that we did, and it has paid huge dividends for our school district. In these examples, we were ahead of the trend, and we need to use more resources to keep up this trend because it is for the betterment of our students and schools. If our students are successful, we will continue to be considered a successful school system. So next, we as a school system need to recognize that resource dependence theory and institutional theory can benefit our school system by the following points. Establishing and using political influence to gain more resources and dollars to build and fund our schools. We are in the process of this with the start of our next school in 2020. When this school is complete, we would have 3 brand new high schools built in the last 15 years. That is pretty successful. Using political influence and student success rates to divert dollars away from charter and virtual schools who threaten to take funding away from our schools. We can do this by having successful schools here in our county, and by doing so, we can keep the competition away. I know that sounds like it's a negative thing, but in order to keep our money in-house, it's best to push our students and have successful schools that our students want to go to. Last, staying ahead of the trends in education and to initiate new and emerging ideas that help us to maintain high levels of student success. The example I used earlier here was that of implementing AP courses and dual enrollment, etc. Well, I hope you all have enjoyed my presentation. I look forward to hearing everyone's feedback as well as looking and watching everyone's presentations. I hope you all have a great night and have a great weekend. Bye.